This presentation is entitled Vagueness and Arbitrariness in Social Ontology. The argument from vagueness and the argument from arbitrariness are arguably the most influential objections against the intuitive picture of material composition, according to which some pluralities of objects compose something and some pluralities of objects compose nothing. These arguments have led philosophers to endorse radical views such as compositional universalism, the view that every plurality of objects composes something, and compositional nihilism, the view that no plurality of objects composes something. The main goal of this presentation is to explore analogues of these arguments for a family of relations I will call social constitution relations, and to discuss their implications for debates in social ontology. The presentation will be divided in 3 parts. In the first part, I will explain the argument from vagueness and the argument from arbitrariness applied to the case of material composition. In the second part, I will introduce social constitution relations, and I will show that you can construct similar arguments for those relations. Finally, I will discuss the implications of these new arguments for debates in social ontology. Let me start by explaining the argument from vagueness. On the version of the argument from vagueness that I will present, it has two premises. According to the first premise, if the intuitive picture of composition is true, then composition is vague. That means that if composition works the way we think it works, then there will be borderline cases of composition. That means that there will be pluralities such that it is vague whether those pluralities compose something or not. The second premise just says that composition is not vague. From these 2 premises, by modus tollens, we can conclude that the intuitive picture is false. Let's now move on to the arbitrariness argument. The arbitrariness argument has a very similar structure. It also has 2 premises, and the first premise says, if the intuitive picture is true, then composition will be arbitrary. Now, what is it for composition to be arbitrary? By arbitrary here, I mean that there will be 2 cases of 2 pluralities of objects with the following feature. Both of them will be pretty much alike with respect to all the aspects that are relevant for composition. However, only one of them will be a case of composition. That is, only one of them will compose an object. So premise 1 says, if the intuitive picture is true, then there are such cases. Premise 2 says, there are no such cases. And again, by modus tollens, it follows that the intuitive picture of composition is false. Now that we have a general idea about the argument from vagueness and the argument from arbitrariness, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to provide some justification for each of the premises. Let me start with the vagueness argument. The first premise of the vagueness argument says that the intuitive picture entails vague composition, entails that the composition is vague. Here's how the reasoning goes for this premise. First of all, we notice that if the intuitive picture is true, then there is a continuous series for composition. A continuous series for composition is a series of cases with the following features. The first case is a case of composition. We have a bunch of pieces of wood here composing a chair. The last case is a case that is not a case of composition. We have those same pieces of wood completely scattered. They do not compose anything. And then each of the cases is such that it differs only minimally from the previous case with respect to all the features relevant for composition. So that is a series for composition. And this first part just says that if the intuitive picture is true, then we can generate a series like this. The second part of this reasoning says that if the intuitive picture is true, then there will be no definite cutoff point in this series, right? A definite cutoff point for composition is defined as a case where composition definitely occurs, and it's followed by a case where composition definitely doesn't occur, right? So if composition works the way we really think it works, then it doesn't seem that we can really find such a definite cutoff point in this series. Therefore, given some assumptions about the logic of definitely, we can conclude that that series has to contain borderline cases. Because it doesn't contain a definite cutoff point, then it has to contain some borderline cases. And that's how we justified premise 1. Let's move on to premise 2, the premise that says that there is no vague composition. Here we need a couple of assumptions. The first assumption says, that I call composition existence, it says that whether a plurality of objects composes something makes a difference as to which things exist. Here the idea is that if you compare the scenario where a certain plurality of objects composes another object and the scenario where those objects don't compose anything, then those two scenarios will differ with respect to which things exist in each scenario, right? So that's basically what this claim is saying. The other claim that we need is the claim that I call no vague existence, according to which it is never vague which things exist. It is always determinate which things exist. Now we reason as follows. First, consider any plurality of objects. Given composition linked to existence, we can say that if it is vague whether that plurality composes something, then it will also be vague which things exist, because there is a connection between composition and existence. Now, given the claim that I call no vague existence, it cannot be vague which things exist. Therefore, by modus tollens, we conclude that it is not vague whether that plurality composes something. Since this plurality was just an arbitrary choice, we can generalize and claim that for no plurality, it is vague whether those objects compose something, that is, composition is never vague. Let's move on now to the premises of the arbitrariness argument. So the first premise says that the intuitive picture entails that composition is arbitrary, right? That means that it entails that there are a couple of cases that are on a par with respect to composition, but only one of them is a case of composition. Again, we're going to take advantage of a premise we've already used, which is that the intuitive picture is able to generate this continuous series for composition, that we already know what it is. And the other premise that we will use is this claim that every continuous series contains a cutoff point. Now here it's important to distinguish between a cutoff point and a definite cutoff point. A definite cutoff point is a case that definitely is a case of composition and is followed by another case that is definitely not a case of composition. A cutoff point just is a case of composition followed by a case that is something that is not a case of composition. And the fact that there has to be a cutoff point is just a result of classical logic. Since we're going to be assuming classical logic, we can assume this premise. Now, provided that this cutoff point and the next case, the two of them are going to be on a par with respect to composition because they are pretty much indistinguishable, it follows that if the intuitive picture is true, then there will be two pluralities that are on a par with respect to composition, but only one of them composes something because only one of them is a cutoff point, so the other doesn't compose something. And this is how we justified premise one that says that the intuitive picture entails arbitrary composition. Let's move on to the second premise that says that composition cannot be arbitrary. Here we're going to be using the same assumption we introduced in the argument from Vagueness that I call composition existence. And we're also going to be using this other assumption that I call no arbitrary existence. And the idea behind no arbitrary existence is that if a certain property is linked to existence in a particular way, namely if the instantiation of that property makes a difference with respect to which things exist, then that property cannot be arbitrary. That means there cannot be cases that are on a par with respect to that property, but only one of them instantiates that property. Now, given this last assumption, given this premise I called no arbitrary existence, it follows that if composition is like that, if composition is linked to existence, then composition cannot be arbitrary. And then the other premise just says that composition is linked to existence. Therefore, it follows that composition cannot be arbitrary. So this is the reasoning behind the second premise of the arbitrariness argument. Now that we have explained the main reasoning behind these two arguments, let me say a few things about the implications of these two arguments for the debates about material composition and the ontology of a material world. So the first thing I want to say is that if you accept that these arguments are sound, then you're typically led to endorse one of two radical views. One of them is compositional universalism, that I already described as the view that every plurality of objects composes something, and the other is compositional nihilism, the view that no plurality of objects composes something. There are other alternative views that are neither the intuitive picture or these radical views, but for different reasons that I don't have time to discuss, philosophers have always chosen between the intuitive picture or these two radical pictures. But then if you don't like this idea of accepting either compositional universalism or nihilism, there are also different ways you can try to resist the argument. And they are kind of analogous. So in the case of the vagueness argument, you can try to resist the premise that says that the intuitive picture entails vague composition. Or you can just reject, you can just say that there's nothing problematic about vague composition, either because existence is vague or because composition is not linked to existence in the way that our premise says. In the case of the arbitrariness argument, you have similar moves. You can reject that the intuitive picture entails arbitrary composition, or you can just say that it is okay for composition to be arbitrary, either because existence can be arbitrary or because there is no link between composition and existence. Moving on to the second part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about social constitution relations. So a social constitution relation is a relation that obtains between some objects and a social object that exists partially in virtue of them. For example, you have a social group and its members, you have a word and its articulations, by that I mean the sound and the shape that you use to utter the word. And so for concreteness sake, I'm going to just focus on the relation of group membership. So we'll know that we can use the relation of parthood to define composition. You can define the x's compose y as each of the x's is a part of y and every part of y overlaps with at least one of the x's. The details of the definition don't really matter. The whole point is just to show you that the relation of composition can be defined in terms of this more basic relation of parthood. Similarly, you can introduce this relation of group membership, and you can use it to define a relation that I'll call group constitution. Roughly, you can think that the x's group constitute y, just in case each of the x's is a member of y and nothing else is a member of y. So this group constitution relation will be a case of an instance of a social constitution relation. Now that we have defined this group constitution relation, we can formulate an analog of Van Inwagen's special composition question that we can call the special group constitution question. And the question will be, under what conditions does a plurality of things group constitute something, right? And what I'm going to show you now is that you can use this relation of group constitution to construct arguments that are exactly that parallel the argument from vagueness and the argument from arbitrariness. And this is supposed to hold also for other social constitution relations that I didn't have time to define. But the project is to generalize these arguments to other kinds of social constitution relations. So the next step is to show that we can formulate analogues of the argument from vagueness and the argument from arbitrariness using this case of social constitution relation, which is group constitution. So I'm going to start by formulating the arguments, and then I'm going to, the argument from vagueness in this case, and then I'm going to argue that, in fact, we have good reason to accept the premises. So the argument will look like this. If our intuitive picture of group constitution is true, then group constitution is vague. Second premise, group constitution is not vague, therefore the intuitive picture is false. Here, the intuitive picture of group constitution is going to be one according to which some pluralities of people group constitute something, and some pluralities of people don't group constitute anything, right? And probably what is relevant for determining which one is the case is the amount of social interaction between people or something like that, right? Now let's see if we can if this argument can be, if we have reason to accept the premises of this argument. Here are the key assumptions. In order to defend the first premise, we need to show that we can create a continuous series for group constitution. And I think we can. We can start with a clear case of a bunch of people who constitute a soccer team, for instance. You end with a case of the same group of people that don't really constitute anything. And then you have a bunch of intermediate cases that differ only minimally with respect to whatever requirements we have for group constitution, right? Then we have the same premise as before. There's no definite cutoff point because there's no point that you can say that here clearly there's group constitution. The next one is not a group constitution. So this premise seems fine. From these two premises, it follows that the intuitive picture does entail vague group constitution. The second premise will be that group constitution is not vague, and then we will need two assumptions, one of them that connects group constitution with existence. And this also seems plausible because it seems like the scenario where some people group constitute something and the scenario where they don't, they really differ with respect to which things exist in each of the scenarios, right? So it's kind of the same motivation behind composition existence as we had before. Finally, no vague existence is just the same premise we had before. If all these premises are plausible, then we have a reasonable case for an argument from vagueness in the case of group constitution. Now, let's move to the argument from arbitrariness, also for the case of group constitution. The argument from arbitrariness would look like this. Premise 1, if the intuitive picture of group constitution is true, then group constitution is arbitrary. Second premise, it cannot be arbitrary, therefore the intuitive picture is false. And here we also need a bunch of assumptions in order for the premises to be plausible. For the third premise, we need, again, the same claim that there is a continuous series for group constitution, but we also need the claim that every continuous series has a cutoff point. We already said that this is just a result from classical logic, so it's nothing special about group constitution here. And from these two premises, it follows premise 1. Finally, a group constitution is not arbitrary. We need the same premise as before. We need the connection between group constitution and existence. And we need no arbitrary existence, which we also used in the original versions of the argument. So given all these assumptions, it seems like we also have a good case for an argument from arbitrariness in the case of group constitution. It's time to discuss the implications of these two arguments. As before, we have one of the options is that if the arguments are sound, then we are kind of forced to adopt either one of these two radical views, right? The first one I will call group universalism, which is the view that every plurality of people group constitutes something. The other view is the one I will call group nihilism, which is the view that no plurality of people group constitutes anything. So this is if you assume that the arguments are sound. The other alternative would be to try to reject the arguments, or resist the arguments, right? And then, as before, we have a bunch of different options. When it comes to the vagueness argument, we can reject that the intuitive picture leads to vague group constitution. We can try to reject that. We can try to just accept that group constitution can be vague, either because existence is vague or because there's no connection between group constitution and existence. When it comes to the arbitrariness argument, we can also reject that the intuitive picture entails arbitrary group constitution, or we can just accept the group constitution can be arbitrary, either because existence can be arbitrary or because there's no link between group constitution and existence. Now, you might think that the options are just exactly the same as in the case of composition. I mean, that will still be a kind of interesting result because now there are kind of some constraints in the kind of views you can adopt about social ontology. But I actually think that there is something more interesting going on here, and that has to do with the differences between the two cases. There are some important disanalogies between the two cases, and the first one is related to the radical views that you can adopt if you decide that the arguments are sound. Social universalism is highly implausible. So compositional universalism, it's kind of counterintuitive because it has the result that, there is something that has my nose and the Eiffel Tower as parts, and that might sound kind of counterintuitive, but at least I think we have some kind of picture of what that object looked like. Right, like that object is located wherever my nose and Eiffel Tower are located. And there is also this kind of common idea that part is cheap, that doesn't take too much for there to be an object that has other objects as parts. And that might be plausible in the case of parthood. But that doesn't seem plausible at all in the case of group constitution, for instance, right? Because if group universalism is true, that means that you pick any plurality of random people in the world, and there will be something to which those people have the same kind of relation that the two members of the Beatles have to the band, the Beatles, right? So then it seems like group constitution seems to be a much more substantial relation than parenthood. And that's what makes group universalism very, very implausible. So that means that if the arguments are sound, then you have to pick social nihilism. And you have to face the same kind of objections that nihilists always face. Maybe this might even be a bit more plausible than compositional nihilism, because it might be easier to get rid of social objects than to get rid of composite objects. But this is just very tentative remarks. Here are a few other ideas that I'm having here. So first of all, there's this strategy that you might think, which is you might think that it is easier to accept that existence can be vague in the case of social objects because they are non-fundamental objects. Now, I'm very skeptical about this kind of strategy, but at least it seems like a potentially interesting alternative. You might also think that in the case of arbitrary existence, it is easier to accept that existence can be arbitrary in the case of social objects because the social world is up to us, and of course you will have to make that more precise, but that's kind of a strategy I imagine somebody trying to pursue. I'm also kind of skeptical about this, but again, this is just a kind of tentative remark. And finally, the other option that I think is much more interesting and I'm trying to develop actually is claiming that there's no link between group constitution and existence, right? The idea would be that whether a bunch of people group constitute something doesn't really have an effect as to which things exist. And the kind of picture that is behind this is something like this. You take a plurality of people and they always constitute a bunch of different things. And what changes between the scenario where they group constitute something and the scenario where they don't group constitute anything is that some of the things that they constitute are groups, and in the other, none of them are groups. That's kind of a plenitudinous picture of social ontology, but I think it's worth studying. And also it's kind of interesting that if you feel more motivated in the case of social ontology to go for something like this because you don't want to accept the arguments and become a nihilist, then it's an interesting question whether you have similar motivations in the case of material composition. Maybe you go back to the arguments related to material composition and you, instead of just accepting the arguments and becoming a universalist, you reconsider your position and maybe try to break the link between composition and existence. But that would be probably for a different occasion. Thank you very much.